Okay, welcome everybody to the November 20th webinar as part of the NINDS Clinical Trials Methodology course. I have a all-star panel here to discuss key items that are important when preparing a grant application. All of them have experience both as the PI of multi-center trials and also reviewing multi-center clinical trial grants on NIH study sections. So this is a real delight and a real honor. I will introduce our panelists. Um, First, I will introduce Dr. David Wright, a professor of emergency medicine at the Emory University College of Medicine and principal investigator of the PROTECT 3 trial. Next, Karen Johnston, professor and chair of neurology at the University of Virginia and principal investigator of the SHINE trial of intense glucose control in acute ischemic stroke. And Robert Silbergleit, who is the principal investigator of the Rampart trial of midazolam in the pre-hospital setting for status epilepticus, and also the up-and-coming ESET trial, established status epilepticus trial, along with his other um, multiple principal investigators. So, for everybody else who's in the room, if there are questions for our panelists, they will be able to see them if you type them into the chat area. We do not have any prepared slides, although I have prepared questions for discussion. I have warned the panelists what questions we will be asking, and we will do a sort of presidential debate type format where I will have somebody who I will ask each question first, and then the other panelists will weigh in if they have additional things to add on those questions. And this should hopefully be a very lively talk. We will be archiving it on our website after it occurs. At the current time, we are not offering CME for this lecture, but we do anticipate being able to offer CME for the entire set of webinars once we've completed them. Also, we would like to sort of make you aware of our next webinar, which will be the final one of the 2014 season, which will be John Marler talking on IDEs and INDs for the sponsor investigator. That will be December 18th at noon. The other announcement I would like to make is to put in a plug for applications for the 2015 cohorts for the Clinical Trials Methodology course. For the next year, we will be having two tracks, both a foundations track for junior clinical investigators or people who are new to clinical trials to get great foundations in designing and implementing a clinical trial protocol. And we will be introducing for the first time an adaptive design track, which is more targeted towards more experienced investigators, people who've been at least the site PI of a clinical trial before, where we will help you to develop an adaptive design for a clinical trial protocol going forward, perhaps for submission to NET or NeuroNext or StrokeNet. So with that, I am going to head over to the discussion guide. And my first discussant is going to be Robert. And then after he releases the microphone, David and Karen can weigh in. I guess it'll be whoever presses the button first to get the microphone will get to talk first. And I will take it away with the first question. So, Dr. Silbergleit, what are the most important aspects of the specific aims page, and what sort of content is usually seen most favorably, and what sort of content raises red flags?
Okay, so I need to hold down the microphone button in order to talk, right?
I think you can just press it, like if you press it on the side, and it'll just turn green and stay green. At least that does it for me.
Okay. Well, I think that the specific aims page is really it's your hook, right? It's the page that everybody's going to read. The way that the review panel is set up, as you've probably discussed in some other sessions, is that there will be a few assigned reviewers that will present your paper, and then that will be discussed, your manuscript, your grant application, and then it'll be discussed by the whole panel. And while you're doing that, the whole panel is probably reading your grant application. The people who hadn't been assigned probably haven't read it prior to the review panel. So they're going to look at your specific games page, and then they're going to sort of skim through to look for key portions later on in the grant application. So the thing that I think you most want to do, remember that depending on what type of panel you're going to go to, people are reading a lot of grant applications. And so what they want to do is you need a hook to say, why is this important? And you should start with that general, what's the problem we're trying to solve and why is it important? And then it's got to go on and tell why this approach is really the cat's meow for doing that. And then you're going to go into the very specific aims of exactly what you're going to answer in the application. And I think that the key elements then are to be unabashed in your enthusiasm for your idea as you present the problems and the solution. And then very specific in your specific aims, but very clear. And that's probably the most important thing, is that you can't get really nuanced and really sophisticated. I mean, you got to lay it out in very clear terms that are going to come across the first time people read it. And that's tough to do. And there probably should be more revisions of your specific aims page than any other part of your grant application for that reason. In terms of red flags, I'm not sure exactly what the red flags are, other than people who specific aims are, we're just going to look at this, things that are very non-specific. You really can't figure out what they're going to do, or something that lacks any kind of impact statement in the specific aims. If there's really nothing that makes you excited about it, that's really not going to go anywhere. I'm not interested in reading the rest of the application at that point. I got to relinquish. Hang on.
I concur with that, Rob. I would add too many aims. You're asking to do too much, and so that's one of the big issues, especially when you're a junior investigator applying, and we're reviewing these, and you're saying you can do all these different things, and it actually, not only is it not feasible many times, it's also more complicated. So keep it simple, and to the point would be probably a major thing that you could do in your aims.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I think that two key pieces in that specific aims, which you've heard from both Robert and David, is you've got to have impact. You've got to hook them with impact. They've got to understand why what you're talking about is going to change. Once you answer the question, it's going to change how we take care of patients, or how we do whatever it is that you're trying to impact. And the other thing is clear and concise. I think the biggest red flag is that if they don't understand what you're doing or why you're doing it right off the bat from the specific aims page, you may have lost them.
All right, very good. At this point, if there's anybody from the audience who wants to type in a sort of additional question on that aspect before we move on to my next sort of set question, I'm certainly welcoming that. And maybe what will make most sense, just in terms of keeping the flow, knowing that we all type at different rates, is we'll move on to the next question. But I think that they'll probably be able to bake some of these responses into the things that kind of pop up below. So at any time, if something sort of is striking you as a question, feel free to type it down there, and we will get, one of the panelists will be getting to it at some point in time, assuming it's an answerable question. Oh wait, well, we got it there. I think I'll let that go back through the grant. I think that's a great question on the interdependence or independence of two or more aims. So I'll cede the microphone.
So I'll speak to this for a minute. I always find that if one of the early specific aims could be positive or negative, and if it's negative, you can't do the rest of the aims, that is a deal breaker for me. If I feel like they are too interdependent and the success of some of the aims depends on an assumed outcome of one of the early aims, that's a problem. Now, if you have them interdependent, but there's a path so that if the first aim is positive or negative, or whatever outcomes, the various outcomes, that the other aims can still occur, that they may be different, they may be occurring differently, but they can still occur, that's okay with me. So that's my perspective. But I do look for that issue. If one aim is required to have a certain answer, and we don't know that that's going to be the answer, otherwise the other aims can't happen, that's a big problem for me.
Yeah, and I sort of fall in between on that. I mean, there are some people for whom that is just, you know, an absolute rule. And for me, it's not so much of an absolute rule as much as it is looking at the scientific dependence of that. I mean, if aim 2 depends on 1 and 3 depends on 2, then that's a very high risk proposal, right? I mean, you don't know that 1 is true. That's why you're doing 1, right? So you can make, to my mind, you can make an argument for doing it that way if that's the way that the science leads out, but it is going to be considered much higher risk. I think there are some other ways of doing that. I think that you can do sub aims. Again, now you're risking getting out of this clarity zone, right? I mean, the more specific you make the specific aims, the more clear the better. We said that up front. If you start getting into specific aim 1, sub aim A, sub aim B, it just gets very convoluted very quickly. So I think it is best to try to stay away from all of that. But I don't know that it's impossible to do, but it's probably not a good idea.
David, anything to add? All right. Well, I will move on to our next question here, and this is for David. That notes, thinking about the entire grant proposal, when you're thinking about turning a clinical trial where you may have a 100-page protocol into something that you have to get across mostly in the first, in the first 12 pages, and really to a certain extent on that single page, what are the key pieces of information that need to be communicated in the research plan? An example is demonstrating that enrollment is feasible, etc. What have you put into your grant applications, and what do you look for as a reviewer? And David will take this one first.
Yeah, there are a lot of pieces to this, so I would expect my colleagues to really jump in and add, and I'll probably come back with others as I remember them. I think when I'm looking at one of these grants, one of the number one things that, as we say in grant review speak, decreases our enthusiasm is the feasibility question. If you have not shown in either a pilot study or in some other format that you can actually enroll the patients, or that you have experience in enrolling patients of the particular type for whatever grant it is that you're doing, or that there are not sufficient patients at your site, or if it's multi-site, the multi-sites, that is probably one of the biggest death knells for a grant submission. It has to be clearly shown that your team or the team that you put together has experience in enrolling these types of patients, or has the capacity to enroll them, or has done it before. And if it's a complicated enrollment process, showing that there's some walkthrough, some sort of data or evidence that you can actually do it. I think it's still under the feasibility umbrella, but one of the other things is over projecting how many patients you can get. And I can't tell you how many grants I've read that said, 100 patients of X come in, we plan to enroll 50% of them. That's already, you basically just lost your grant. So if you need to be realistic, the rule typically is that if there's 100 patients that meet all of your inclusion-exclusion criteria, you can enroll at the most 10%. When we see that sort of conservatism in your grant, we go, okay, this guy knows what they're doing, or gal knows what's going on. So those projected numbers are very dangerous if you're not careful, and people who are out there who have experience can help you with that. I think one of the other things that really gets a number of grants is the sort of tacit inclusion of a good statistical team. So you'll see like a 5% or 10% for a statistician on the grant, and everybody will, mostly the stats guys will go, they really haven't thought this through, and they're not really including the people they need to make this successful. So, it's the statistician is not somebody that you think of after you've written your grant or after you've written your proposal. It's really somebody in a whole team of people that need to be engaged up front. Not being a statistician at all myself, I think it's a risk for those of you who know a little bit of stats and you try to write a grant and then you say, okay, well, I'll put a stats person on for 5 or 10%. That's also a real big warning flag. And then lastly, I'll say this, there's many more, but I want to give the other guys opportunity. It's sort of when we're ranking these and you get a review back and you look at the team, typically there are not a lot of comments in that segment, and I guess that's just because from a person-to-person standpoint, you don't want to be negative about an individual, but it gets subtly put in other parts of the grant review process. So if you have no experience in a trial and you're coming on as a new investigator, you really need to surround yourself with either co-investigators or other folks that do have experience in the particular area that you're looking, and that actually have legitimately enough time put on the grant that shows that they're going to be engaged and involved. You can't just put people's names on there and give them 1% or less. Cost share. That's going to be picked up very quickly by the reviewers. So your team really is important. Unfortunately, and when you get your review backs, it's going to be review back. It may be hard for you to figure that it was your team that lost you the grant. So that's a real important piece. And I'll give away the microphone now.
I would agree with that. I think that the most key pieces for me are that the impact, the continued demonstration throughout the document that you're going to have impact, and that you're continuing to convince the review team that what you're doing is going to have impact. And what David said, feasibility, feasibility, feasibility. I think that's probably one of the most important pieces, that we understand that what you're saying you can do, you actually are demonstrating to us is really feasible by you and your team. I think those are probably two of the biggest points.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that a lot of times what gets lost for me is in the what used to be the background section and now is in the reorganized sections, but the early sections of the grant where you're building your case for impact. It should be more of a narrative. It should tell a story. You should take people from, this is the nature of the problem, this is where things have gone wrong, this is the knowledge gap, and here's how it needs to get filled and how we're going to fill it. A lot of times it's just sort of scattered. It's a cut and pasted, stroke is a problem, boom. And it doesn't really build logically to the intervention that's being tested. And I think that the extent that you can make that a logical progression or a story, a narrative, better it's going to read. And I think that is key. There's no doubt about the feasibility stuff. I mean, other than to reinforce it, I think that how you reinforce it, the more you can reinforce it with data, the better. So I mean, you can explain why it's feasible, but it's not as good as if you say that we pulled the charts and we applied the eligibility criteria to a set of 500 charts and determined that we had this many, rather than we estimate. 10% would be is a nice conservative estimate, Dave. But even better would be if you can actually, estimate based on data and then cut it in half, right? And because you know that you can't do as well as you possibly could do. But to the extent that you can do with data, the better.
Yeah, I would add one more thing that I think is really important. which is that I need to understand it. I think all of the reviewers have very different backgrounds. So if you're a Parkinson's disease doc doing Parkinson's disease research and you use a lot of terminology that I don't understand, you're going to lose me. So one of the other things I think about when I'm working with folks is you've got to take it to a very basic level so everybody on the panel can understand the basic concepts, and yet you've got to be sophisticated enough that all of the people in your subspecialty respect your knowledge base and your level of scientific sophistication. So it's a little bit of a dance. But if you lose 3/4 of the committee right off the bat because they have no understanding of what you're doing, that's going to be very hard to recover from.
David, was there anything else that you remember that you wanted to cover on this in this general area of inclusion stuff? Okay, you're good. Excellent. And again, for those of you who may have be just joining us, I have not allowed the audience to have a audio voice, but please put any questions or comments into the chat window, and the panelists will try to address your questions or comments as they come up. So the next question is going to be for the next two questions are for Karen. You know, kind of if anybody does the fantasy football draft, you know, when you go last, you get the next pick of the next round. So, Karen, what are the qualities of grant proposals that tend to change your mind from I don't think they can do this to they can do this and it is important?
Yeah, so I think some of these things we've already talked about, and really Robert just hit on this. This is such a key piece for me, is as I'm reading through the specific aims, et cetera, I'm thinking about a lot of feasibility issues. Once they get to presenting data and exactly what Robert just said, those kind of data where you say, not only do I believe I can enroll 300 patients in 3 years, but here's the data that demonstrates I can do it. So we have 300 Parkinson patients a year. We've applied the eligibility criteria. We have 109 that meet eligibility criteria in a 24-month period. Therefore, my estimate of 75 patients in a 24-month period, I think is realistic. That totally sells me. If you can do that, that's the kind of thing that will make me believe that it's feasible. The other thing that I really like to see is that somebody's actually started enrolling. So not only that they're screening patients, but we've actually enrolled the first 11 patients of our 76 patients. So you've demonstrated, again, feasibility, that you can identify them, you can consent them, they will participate, they will complete the period of time that you need them for, follow-up is happening, all those things. That's very helpful to me. The other thing that I really like to see that convinces me is a realistic timeline. I don't know how many of you guys have seen this, but to see somebody say that they're going to start enrolling on day 1 of year 1 of the grant is profoundly unrealistic. So there's a whole startup period, and I really need to see that there's an understanding of the timeline from startup to enrollment, follow-up, that there's a perspective of the entire timeline and that it's realistic. Again, it all comes back to feasibility. So I think that that's an important part. And then the other piece that I think is really important to me, because it's not uncommon for many of us to read something and say, yeah, this might work, but it might not, is to hear what the backup plan is to hear that, you know, I'm planning on enrolling 25 patients a year for 3 years, but if I can't get those 25 patients a year for 3 years with my 3 sites or whatever, I have these other sites lined up, they will participate, these are the numbers they have, so that the applicant has already developed a plan if there's a problem or some unexpected obstacle. So I would say those are 3 of the biggest things for me, and I'll turn it over.
Yeah, I would to follow on with that, recognizing the limitations and addressing them, whatever they may be, if they're technical limitations, if they're feasibility or enrollment limitations, and going ahead and putting some of those in there. And the danger is be careful to say, these are all the limitations and we have everything solved. That's naive as well. But that these are some of the more major limitations, and here's how we were addressing them, can be helpful at times.
Whoa, where'd Dave go? Okay. Yeah, so I agree. The other one for me that makes a big difference is the protocol. So with at least with NINDS clinical trial grant application FOAs, there's a requirement that those come in with a protocol in the appendix, and it's a lot of times it's hard because you at that point you don't have any funding, and the actually getting funding and getting started seems so remote that the protocol seems like something that could be pretty rough. And I guess that's maybe okay, but in terms of asking your question of what convinces me and changes me from, you know, maybe not so much to maybe so, in terms of whether they can do it, is looking at the protocol, because you can tell a protocol that's written by somebody who has not done a trial before and a protocol that's written by people who have done a trial before. And if it comes across as one that has not been done before, that's okay if the principal investigator hasn't been, but it means that they're not working with anybody who's done it before either, and it's worrisome. So putting some time and attention into the protocol up front, I mean, that's a really sweet deal, actually, for people who are submitting clinical trial applications to NINDS, that the protocol goes in the appendix. The risk is that not everybody might read through the protocol in great detail, but I always did. In terms of the one contraindication, I would say is I'm not so sure that I agree with Karen about being happy that they've already enrolled some patients. I find that a little problematic sometimes, because I'm not sure, depending on the intervention, that it's ethical when you know you don't have the resources to do the trial that is going to answer the question. Starting the trial with your own dollars and getting a few people under the belt, hoping that it'll get funded, I'm not so sure about it. That might not be ethical to me, or wise. But it does show. I mean, I understand that it shows the feasibility, so it's a trade-off. But I'm not entirely sure that I like that.
Aaron, I think, maybe if you want to respond, I mean, you may be meaning maybe in some sort of prospective observational cohort or something that seems to be the same population as opposed to the exact protocol with the same inference.
Exactly. So I think demonstrating that you can capture the population that you're talking about is really important. And Robert may be right that actually starting the actual trial that you're trying to get funding for may be dangerous, but clearly Robert doesn't have a chair like our team has a chair who will support them whether they get a grant or not, which is also something very important to say, that we're doing this with or without you because we believe in it that much. But I appreciate that point. But I think, again, if you have some kind of brief feasibility project before it or preliminary data, something like that, that is very impactful to me. If you can demonstrate to me that you have already almost worked out the bugs of identifying the patient population and enrolling them, that does help me a lot.
Very good. Robert or David, any follow-on comments there? Oops, sorry. You can't talk. I see your lips moving. That's my fault. Let me give you the mic.
So I agree with Karen. I mean, if a preliminary project or a pilot or something that demonstrates feasibility, especially if something where feasibility is really going to be the question, I don't think you're going to be able to do that. If you show that you've done it 11 times already in a pilot phase testing feasibility, that's nice.
Right, and I think doing that in such, and one of the challenges from the trainees who are in our cohort this year is designing small clinical trials in a way that you're getting information that is useful can be challenging, can be a little bit harder than even the design of the larger trials where you have the laws of large numbers to get over some of those humps. But I think demonstrating that the nuts and bolts of gosh, how do you find these stroke patients within 4 hours of onset and get a team to them and make sure they have these inclusion criteria? I think those sorts of demonstrations in a project like this, if I can deliver this protocol and get people to listen to me when they're at the bedside and they have to consent for their family members, I think those sorts of things are quite valuable. So again, if there's any questions or other comments, please use that chat function at the bottom of the window here. I will move on to my fourth planned question, and again, this is for Karen. How can you strategically make use of the human subjects protection or other non-page limited sections of the grant to communicate your protocol? And how do you look at those sections as a reviewer?
I think this is an important piece, especially because probably most of you realize that all the information that you want to share in your grant, you don't have enough space to share it all. So you do have to strategically think about which components of that you could pull out and put into other sections. So some of it may be in the investigator section or the budget section, and some of it may be in the resource section. But there is a huge opportunity in the human subject section to talk about some of the details of the protocol that will demonstrate that you are really thoughtful about your design or your strategy that I think are helpful. So the first one I generally recommend is in the body of the grant to, assuming that you don't have space for everything, to describe generally the population that you plan to enroll. So for an ischemic stroke population, you might say something like, we will be enrolling adults with ischemic stroke who are hyperglycemic, but the details of the eligibility criteria are outlined in the human subject section. So then in the human subject section, what I can do is outline all of the exact inclusion, exclusion criteria, not only the list of them, but why I chose that group of eligibility criteria. So it's clear that I've thought about who the population is that I want and why. Why am I excluding children? It's not just because it's inconvenient. I'm excluding children because strokes in children are a different disease. It's not a convenience for me. It's a scientific reason why I'm excluding that population. That's the level that you want to talk about your eligibility criteria. You can also do things with the recruitment data, the stuff that we just talked about that Robert brought up, all of the information demonstrating that you have carefully considered how frequently you're going to see this population and how frequently you're going to be able to randomize them into your trial or enroll them into your trial. Giving them those data in that human subject section can be a very helpful place because, again, you're not going to have a lot of space in the body of the grant to describe all of that. You may have a little bit of it in the preliminary data, but you're going to describe all those calculations of how many total Parkinson's patients or stroke patients your center sees and what proportion you've determined are potentially eligible, and then what proportion you are likely to enroll. Again, having data in that section that convinces me that you have the population, that you understand the population that you want, and that you have the population can be very helpful. And then again, the timeline, for me, the timeline is really important to me. And again, you're not going to have a lot of space to put that in the body of the grant. So sometimes you can put the timeline of the grant in the human subject section if you're going to specifically, again, talk about this startup period and why it's important to get IRB approval, and you're gonna allow 6 months or 8 months to do contracts and IRB approval and those kinds of things to demonstrate to the reviewers that you really understand the whole process and the whole timeline. And then the other thing I would mention is the consent. If there's any tricky part of the consent process or the population, like the head injury population, the status epilepticus population, populations that both these guys have dealt with, the Alzheimer's disease population, there may be issues of how you consent that population, and that kind of stuff can also go in the human subject section. Again, it's an opportunity to demonstrate that you understand the issues of your population and your research design. Also, blinding, the mechanism that you're choosing to do randomization or whatever allocation mechanism, you can sneak that often into the human subject section. Again, demonstrating that you understand those basic scientific concepts.
Yeah, going back to what Karen said about including the data on numbers of patients. This is really a great way to do this. If you can actually, this is where you can put maps, geographic maps. You can put a geographic map of where your different patient populations are coming from. If you have multiple sites and what they're contributing. So, University of Cincinnati is contributing, and you use the tables actually that request the numbers of different mixes, like African American versus Caucasian and the different ethnicities. I actually had a whole section where, in one of my proposals, where I had for each of the enrollment sites that I was including, I had that breakdown for every single one of those sites, not just the summary table that's required in the lower section. And I put a map in there with that was just very easy and clean to read. And it's beautiful information that, as Karen said, it gives you, you've thought about what your target population is and where they're coming from and what those numbers look like way ahead of time. And here's a great place to sort of just let it flow, because there's no limitation on this section. Now, if it's bigger than the rest of the grant, you might end up looking like you're going around the rules, and that's also a very bad thing. So you don't want to look like you're going around the rules. But this is legitimate to put in there. And you don't have room for graphs and maps, really, very much of that in your main proposal, because it just takes up so much room. So this is a really good place to put it. Any safety stuff, like any drug, pharmacokinetic, and safety stuff that, again, can be couched under safety, can be put into this area as well, legitimately put in there. Especially, for example, for PROTECT, our whole EFIC argument about why EFIC was necessary and how it fit the federal regulations. The whole thing was in this section of the grant. And then if you do, which also looks good, any community outreach, you do any surveying of people about whether they think this trial would be a good idea for your community or its importance, this is a good place to put that kind of information. You don't have it often unless you're doing an EFIC trial where you have to have community consultation, but community outreach is a big deal now, and some of the different types of trials that are out there require it. So this is a good place that you can put that information, again, cleanly. I mean, you don't want, remember, as Robert said at the top of the hour, a lot of these are getting read on the airplane or in the morning with a cup of coffee. And so if you just make this thing uber verbose, it's going to really piss the reviewer off. And the last thing you want to do is piss off your reviewer. So clean, concise, very directed, and nice maps and colors in this section work well for that.
Yeah, so I agree. I do think I want to emphasize that part about being careful about offloading stuff in there that doesn't belong there just because you ran out of space and you had to put it somewhere. You don't want to violate the rules, but I think a lot of stuff can legitimately go there. And I agree. I think that one of the things that both people have said, and I just want to make explicit, is it's a good place for the detail that you didn't have space for in the first 12 pages. If it's a very important idea, you still want to have the idea introduced somewhere in your 12 pages, right? Because that's definitely going to get read. To the extent that you have more detail about that topic, I would, mark it specifically. Make the and I think Karen said this. Make the general idea there, and then reference section 6 point whatever in the human subjects protection section. And I think signposting is very important throughout the grant, actually. Having relatively manageable chunks of text that are highlighted by a flag that tells you what's in that text, so that people who are skimming through the grant application can find the answers to their questions readily. And I would do that in the human subjects protection section as well. Have lots of signposts, have the details tagged out into separate sections, and then you can refer people back to those specific sections from your 12 pages. And I think that's very important. So the same is true for things in the protocol themselves, which is a place that you can put things that are more detailed than can be fit into the 12 pages that you want to refer to, but don't fit in human subjects protection.
I have a sort of different question, although it's been mostly saturated by the great responses we've had so far. I think what I would like is maybe to call a slight audible here and have Robert and David and Karen expand on the idea of signposting. One bit of advice that I had received is that, again, sometimes people are only going to read the specific aims pages. Maybe the slightly more motivated, not primary reviewer, maybe all they're going to do is read your signposts. So, Robert, do you want to expand upon how you can use a signpost to tell a story, even by itself?
Well, I mean, so you should be able to, right? I mean, it's your outline. Your outline should turn into your to your signposts for your narrative, and they should build from one statement to another. A is true and is a big problem. That big problem is unable to be answered because of this. There should be a logical progression in your headings, and then the paragraph explains that idea. That was how they taught you to write in elementary school, right? It's your inverted um, your inverted pyramid, right? You're going to start each paragraph with a sentence that says what you're going to say in that paragraph, and then that paragraph is going to defend that initial statement with detail, and then the last sentence of the paragraph is going to sum up and give you the transition to the next paragraph, right? So essentially, that header of that section can be a summary of that first sentence. It's going to be the idea that you're going to defend by the next set of sentences. And yeah, I mean, you can look at your outline. If you can't really follow the story in your outline, then you can't really follow the story in your headers. And if you can, then you should be able to do the latter as well. And then the key is when you're looking for places to make sure that you fit within your 12 pages is to get rid of the redundancy. Don't tell people the same thing over and over again because that's inefficient and boring.
Yeah, so I would just add to keep in mind that you have the story in your head and you've been thinking about the story, but your reviewers don't know the story. It's the first time they've heard it. So giving them those markers to carry them along. And also, like you've heard, they may have 10 or 12 grants to review. So there are moments when they're not absorbing everything. And so giving them places where they can kind of reorganize where they are in the story can be very helpful. Again, you're trying to keep them on track with the overall story of what you need to do and why you're the right person to do it.
I beat you, Dave. And along those lines, I'll tell you one of the things that I do. I don't know if everyone else reads this way too, but I mean, if it's well signposted like that, I read the header, and if I completely believe it, the header is completely understandable, I don't necessarily even read that paragraph, right? Because I know that's true. The paragraph I'm going to read is when I read the header and say, I'm not so sure that's true. And then I read the paragraph to see if they can convince me. So, there was a movie called Gross Anatomy a long time ago. And it's about medical students, and one of the medical students is sort of a slacker, and he only reads the boldface. He said, I studied. I didn't think it was so hard. They said, how do you study so quickly? He says, I just read the stuff in boldface. And I think that can be true from grant applications sometimes.
Say that I tried that for my first set of medical school exams, and it really didn't go well. And everybody else was like, oh, they just tested you on the least important thing on each page. And I was like, anyway, David, I will hand the microphone to you.
No, I really I read these grants like an outline as well, and if you can direct me through the grant very quickly, you win bonus points. So I find it very important. The other thing is, as I think Karen alluded to, is when we're defending this grant, it's kind of interesting the way the whole process works. Is you're assigned a reviewer. You have the primary reviewer, which basically is responsible for providing the overview of the grant itself, and then you have a number of secondary reviewers. One is typically a statistician, and then a host of others that review it for content and detail. And those reviewers actually theoretically have read everything. But when you're defending it and you're sitting there trying to find something because somebody made a comment about it that you don't agree with, you're flipping through to find out, well, I thought they did say what the sample size was, or that I thought they did say that they could do this. And so it's, it's a little bit, it's a lot easier actually if you have it sort of laid out in a really nice tagged or outline format. So that's all I have to say.
So I think my last sort of set question, and again, anybody in the audience, please write in that chat window at the bottom other things you'd like them to weigh in on. This is the sort of last set question I have is, and we'll give it to David. What sort of information, and this would include both regular and bonus sections, have you seen people include, I think we covered well how you can move necessary information to areas where you might have a little space, but what information have you seen people include in grants that is really actually not necessary and is a distraction and could potentially be deleted to free up space, not moved, but just not there?
Probably the biggest problem is just repeating yourself throughout the grant. There are some times where you need to emphasize particular points, but it really gets frustrating when I'm reading this and I keep reading the same justification over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So that's probably the biggest problem that we see that's included in there. And another example of that is there'll be an inclusion-exclusion criteria table, and then you'll see it in print in paragraph format as well. So, I mean, all that's just a waste of space. It's not necessary. What are other things that are included that just simply aren't? I don't know. I'm going to turn it over to the other team and, while I think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a lot more to add. Certainly the redundancy. Most of the stuff that you have to swim through is required, right? Most of the wasted stuff that doesn't really need to be there is actually a requirement. So I don't know what to say about that. I mean, there's lots of stuff. I guess one of the places that I do think there's a lot of room for improvement, although I think that it's not usually done well, is, and I think Karen mentioned this, is using like the resources section as something other than boilerplate about your university being a great place with lots of beds and lots of training programs. To the extent that you can actually make that resources section tell me the resources that you have that are going to make you do this grant application well, and reference people to it, because people might not actually look for meaningful information there because it's so rarely there. But I think that that's useful. Otherwise, I'm spending a lot of time reading about institutional resources that have absolutely nothing to do with the grant application, and I don't find that helpful. But it is common, so I don't know.
I will add that you made me think about it, Robert. Actually, where I tend to get frustrated is in the section that used to be called pilot data or data to support the ongoing study. And often you see data presented that is really erroneous. I mean, it's not in the same study group. It's not in the same, with some rats. I don't know. It's just irrelevant. and it gets nailed very quickly by the informed reviewers. They'll look at this and go, they provided all this background data and all of this pilot data, but it's completely irrelevant because this isn't the same group, or some other characteristic of it. And so if you think, if you're really pressured to put pilot data in there and you don't have any, don't take a chance and put somebody else's data in there. I mean, I'm not talking about fraud. I'm talking about just using data that really doesn't support you doing the study or that you did this. So
I'll add, and I think Robin Conwood has a point on the screen also that relates to this. I think it's about bringing up a concept that may be foreign to the reviewer. So either you're talking about some data like Robin's talking about that the results aren't out yet, but you don't have time to explain them, and there's no place for the reviewer to go look it up. So opening a can of worms and not being able to tell the whole story, I think, can be problematic. And it's the same thing that I think David's talking about in the preliminary data section. Don't start to tell a story without linking it to why it's seminal to this primary story you're telling. If you don't have time to link it, don't bring it in at all, because it just confuses your reviewers and makes them think you've missed something there. That makes it look like you're not as thoughtful as you've been. So I think Robin's comment links to what David is saying, links to this whole concept of don't bring it in unless you can tie it to the primary story and fill in the gaps for the reviewer that may not understand how you're thinking. And then I think there's another question there, Will, about one school of thought that there may be a degree of repetition that's necessary. And again, I agree with that idea, but it's very select. So it's the big concepts. So bringing the impact back in as you talk about the population to say, this is the population we're going to have the most impact on, or we want to make sure we have a diverse group so we can maximize the impact. So there's some concepts that I find that you want to bring back, the big concepts, safety, big concepts that you want to bring back in multiple sections, but justification over and over again or details over and over again are not helpful.
Yeah, two comments about the things that we're talking about. So about that last one, I didn't mean to say that you don't reinforce the key concepts. When I say repetition, I'm talking about repeating details more than repeating concepts. I mean, there's still a notion anytime you are communicating with people, you need to tell them what you're going to tell them what you're telling them, and then tell them what you told them. But you don't need to. But if you find that you're cutting and pasting sentences from one section to another section, that's really the problem. I mean, you should never be repeating the details, so repeating the content over and over again. And then with regard to Robin's point, I think Robin's point is very good. And just to go on with what you're saying, Karen, you don't want to introduce something that you can't deliver on. But at the same time, if there's something seminal in the field that that the reviewer knows you're going to be aware of, you can't not be aware of it. You can't just pretend it wasn't there. So I think that was Robin's point, is that if there's something seminal that's going on, you might actually have to wait for that to be discussable if it's fundamental to the grant application. And if somebody was doing the same thing that you're proposing to do in Europe, and they just finished and they're going to present it next month, you can't sort of just not mention it, right? At the same time, it's very hard to mention it but not be able to say anything about it. So I think you have to do what Robin's saying, and you have to wait a month, and you have to find out what they're saying and include it in the grant application.
All right. I'm going to let, we're about 5 till the hour here. I'm going to just go through and let David, Robert, and Karen give any final comments. And if there are any additional questions, unless you are an extremely fast typer, please, start to type those in there. But it's funny, you can watch people's eyes go up to where the microphone thing is. So we'll see who can get it first for their closing remarks.
So I think I got it. Did I get it? Okay, so I had two things that I just wanted to briefly mention that most of you probably are already thinking about, and it can be tricky about where to put it in the grant. And a lot of times you don't put it in the grant, but you probably need to demonstrate that you've thought about it. And those are the case report forms. So you need some mechanism of documenting the data from the patients you're enrolling. And then some kind of manual of procedure, some kind of document that are the rules of the road for all of the folks that are going to be enrolling patients in your research program. So something that you can use when you publish as the rules of the road, or that different people will have so they know what the rules of the road are. So often I think people don't put them in the appendices, though sometimes people will put an outline of a manual of procedures or a case report form in the appendices. But at least having something in your timeline that says we have started a manual of procedures and we will complete it within this time period, or we have a basic case report form and we will complete it in this time period, I think is important. It tells me that you're thinking about the less fun and sexy parts of clinical research, but really key parts of doing it well and doing it in a standardized way.
All right, so I'll go next. As I sort of said at the top of the hour, to me, one of the most fundamental pieces is making sure that you articulate and document the feasibility of enrolling however many number of subjects that you say that you're going to enroll, and that you have a source for those subjects. The other points that we didn't really mention per se is write, just kind of a general comment, is to write with the reviewer in mind. It's a really, remember like that there's multiple grants that the reviewer is reviewing. They may not be expertise in that particular content, and so you need to, I'm not saying dumb it down, but kind of give up the acronyms to some degree, and be very concise and clear as if the public was reading this. Then the other I would say is, and I guess Robin's on the call, but I think calling your program officer and having, if you're a junior and working with your program officer through the process, I think is very helpful. And they can really be your friend and help guide you. Then the last is make sure you engage your mentors and your colleagues in this process. Have your grant read by multiple people who have written grants before. Have them comment on them, and all of those other things can be really invaluable for you in cleaning up, making sure it's readable. Have your spouse read it. Does this make sense to you? Because if it doesn't make sense to your spouse, maybe it won't make sense to the reviewers. So, those types of things to really make sure it's nice and clean and concise and to the point.
Hard to beat that. That, I mean, that which is written without pain is read without pleasure. You gotta. It's not a matter of just getting all the facts in there, right? It's not going to be, the grant application is not going to be given to you or not given to you based on merely the numbers that you are able to shove in to the grant application. It's a human process. It's got to be clear. It's got to be well organized. It's got to be reasonably well written. They don't all have to be well written, otherwise we'd have even fewer grants. But it should help the reviewer. I think what Dave was saying earlier is very important. First, you've got to sell the reviewer, and then you've got to have a grant application that the reviewer can sell to the rest of the committee. And to the extent that you can write with both of those goals in mind, I think that increases your chances of being successful.
Good. Well, now I have the microphone, and it is just at 1 o'clock. So I really would like to thank our panelists and thank the NINDS and Robin Conway and the generous support in creating the clinical trials methodology course. Please, I put a link at the bottom to where our webinar evaluation form is. It can also be found on neurotrials.training, our website, under the webinar section. This will be posted relatively soon, hopefully within a week or so when we get the recording up. And please tune in for our next webinar we have in December. Please, again, if you can fill out those applications, we want to make these sorts of things even better next year, so your evaluations are worth a great deal to us. So thank you for your attention, and that will conclude this session.